They can name their attachment style before they can name what they actually want from life. They know the difference between a trauma response and a bad habit. They've read about dopamine loops, toxic relationships, and nervous system regulation. They follow therapists on social media. They speak fluently in psychological language that took previous generations decades or entire therapy careers to discover. And yet, this same generation reports the highest rates of anxiety, loneliness, and purposelessness in recorded history. More awareness, more suffering. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns like this don't appear randomly. They appear when something deep, something most people never think to question, has gone quietly wrong. The question isn't what they know. The question is, why isn't it working? Think about what it means to grow up with a camera already pointed at you. Not a physical camera, something subtler. A permanent audience, a running score of likes, views, and reactions, each word slightly weighted, attached to every version of yourself you tried on during the most vulnerable years of your life. Previous generations got to be awkward in private. They got to change their minds quietly. They got to figure out who they were before anyone was watching. Gen Z didn't get that. Psychologist Leon Festinger called it social comparison theory, the human instinct to measure yourself against others. It's always existed, but it was never running at this speed, never at this scale, never 24 hours a day, starting at age 11. And here's what that quietly does. When the world defines you before you define yourself, psychologists call that identity foreclosure. You adopt a self, you perform it, 2 short beats, but you never actually chose it. So who are you really? Underneath all of that. To understand what happened next, you have to go deeper than behavior. You have to go inside the brain. Every time you scroll and land on something surprising, a funny video, a shocking headline, an unexpected moment, your brain releases a small burst of dopamine. That feels good. So you scroll again and again. Each repetition flatter, more mechanical. The reward isn't guaranteed. That's actually the point. Neuroscientists call it variable reward scheduling. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling so difficult to stop. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered. And Gen Z's brain was still forming while this was happening. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for identity, emotional regulation, and long-term thinking, doesn't fully develop until around age 25. Those critical years of development were spent inside systems specifically designed to interrupt focus and outsource stimulation. Here's what quietly disappeared in the process. Boredom. That sounds like a relief. It wasn't. Neuroscience now recognizes that boredom is where the self gets built. It's the mental space where you ask, who am I when nothing is distracting me? That question never got asked, and that silence left something important unfinished. So if the brain never got the space to ask, who am I, what happened to the answer? Erik Erikson spent his career mapping the stages every human mind moves through, and he identified one stage as the most critical of all: adolescence, the years where the central psychological task is simple but enormous. Figure out who you are. Previous generations did this messily, privately. They tried on personalities like clothes nobody else could see. They failed, changed, reinvented, without an audience scoring every attempt. Gen Z did this on a stage. Every phase was public. Every identity was documented. Every reinvention was archived and searchable. The audience had opinions. The algorithm had preferences. Erikson called the failure of this stage identity diffusion. When you've been so many things for so many people that you no longer know which one is real. It's not confusion. It's exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been performing so long they've forgotten what it felt like to simply exist. But here's the uncomfortable question that comes next. If the identity was never truly formed, what moved in to fill that empty space? What filled the space was knowledge, specifically, the language of psychology itself. Gen Z became the most psychologically literate generation in history. They learned about attachment theory, nervous system responses, cognitive distortions, and childhood wounds. They found this language online, in therapy, in content created specifically for them. And for a moment, it felt like the answer. Finally, a map for the pain. But here's where it gets uncomfortably interesting. Sigmund Freud identified a defense mechanism he called intellectualization. It's what the mind does when emotion feels too dangerous to actually feel. It converts the feeling into a concept. It narrates the wound instead of healing it. Knowing you have an anxious attachment style, matter of fact, doesn't stop your chest from tightening when someone doesn't text back. Knowing your cortisol is elevated, flat and almost clinical, doesn't make the 3 a.m. spiral stop. The map is not the territory. And for an entire generation, the map became a substitute for the journey. Understanding why you're suffering became a way of managing the suffering without ever actually moving through it. So what does? What actually breaks the loop? So the psychological tools weren't enough. And underneath that realization sits something even heavier. Because this isn't just about awareness failing. It's about something more fundamental running out. Meaning. Viktor Frankl survived Nazi concentration camps and emerged with one central conclusion about human psychology. People can endure almost any how if they have a strong enough why. His life's work, logotherapy, was built on a single premise. Humans don't just need happiness, they need purpose. Without it, he wrote, what settles in is what he called an existential vacuum, a quiet, persistent emptiness that no distraction can permanently fill. Previous generations didn't have to search for meaning, they inherited it. Nationalism gave them belonging. Career progression promised that effort had direction. Family structure told them what came next. These weren't perfect systems, but they were maps. And Gen Z inherited the moment those maps burned. And then the internet arrived, carrying every possible belief system, every possible worldview, every possible answer, all simultaneously, all equally questionable, all available at age 13. When everything is equally meaningful, nothing feels meaningful at all. That restlessness you feel, that low hum of "is this it?" That isn't laziness. Frankl had a name for it, and now you do too. But naming the emptiness still doesn't fill it. So the question becomes, what does a generation do when the old systems are gone and the new ones haven't arrived yet? Watch what Gen Z actually does with that emptiness. They stop. They disengage from careers that feel hollow. They quietly quit jobs that ask for everything and return nothing real. They step back from institutions that promise meaning but visibly deliver exhaustion. Older generations look at this and see apathy, laziness, a generation that simply doesn't want to try. But psychologist Martin Seligman saw something like this in a laboratory decades ago, and what he found tells a completely different story. In his research on learned helplessness, Seligman observed that when effort consistently produces no meaningful result, the mind doesn't just get frustrated, it stops. Not from weakness, from intelligence. The brain concludes, accurately, that the system isn't responding, so it withdraws to protect itself. That withdrawal isn't giving up. It's a refusal to perform meaning that isn't genuinely felt, a refusal to chase purpose that belongs to someone else's map. And underneath every quiet resignation, underneath every "I don't see the point," there is a question still searching for an honest answer. Not apathy, a standard. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Here's what all of this actually means. Every pressure this generation faces, the identity confusion, the meaning collapse, the awareness trap, the learned helplessness, is also quietly the most rigorous psychological education any generation has been forced to undergo. No generation has been pushed to ask, who am I really? with this much honesty, this much urgency, this much at stake. That question, seriously, where real identity begins. You're not broken for feeling lost in a world that handed you no map. You're the first generation being forced to draw one from scratch. And that is not a weakness. That is exactly where strength begins to form. There's just one final question. If you understand all of this, why is actually changing still so difficult? That answer reaches deeper than psychology, deeper than awareness, deeper than everything we covered today. And it's worth exploring next.